Yabbo Thompson, who's coming to us from Hobart, and Yabbo is about to speak to us about women in STEM. So if you're, or whichever it is that you want to address, Yabbo, it's really wonderful to have you. Thank you for participating.
Nice to see you, Jocelynne. You're actually in Australia?
Yes, in Sydney.
I was thinking you'd be the middle of the night if you were how you going to do that. So what do you want me to, I mean, there were three particular things I thought I could address. Obviously, the violence against women, the equal, the pay issue, reproductive health, and the climate issue, as well as talking a bit about what we'd say in Tasmania, Aboriginal women, or on the mainland, Indigenous women.
Well, start off.
Okay, I'll start off.
Yeah.
So I had written a paper for last October for the first activism face-to-face meeting of Amnesty since COVID. And one of the things that I think has happened for women in particular is going backwards because of COVID, and also from COVID, the cost of living. And I think that's been a really difficult aspect for women. So what I actually addressed for Amnesty was in relation to us having a Human Rights Act for Australia, which is long overdue. And it's going to be a longish campaign, I think. The fact of the violence issue, I was part of for 6 years an Amnesty group getting together a report on women suffering from family violence. And we came up with a very good report that actually the government took a lot of it for their first women's report action plan and what they called it was to reduce violence against women. Thank goodness we got rid of the last government, which had become fairly crazy with a very difficult prime minister in terms of his religious beliefs, which were brought over into the governments. And this government, the Labor government, have now got the next report. We've had, this must be about the fourth or fifth, and I've been on the Tasmanian government support group, I forget what that was called, committee to do with violence against women. And this report is now the National Plan of Action to stop violence against women. That's a definite step forward, and that's obviously meaning children as well. I think that it's terrible that we've still got the 1 in 3. Sometimes they say 1 in 5, but mostly the figures I've seen is still 1 in 3 women suffering this violence here, and it's also the global figure. So, we still haven't come up with the kind of action strategies that we need. And I know in Tasmania we've lacked a men's service for some time, and I meant to kind of talk to our Catholic agency, Catholic Kerr, because they were the ones who had a very good men's group, and there were a couple of other places. So I'm not really sure that there's, apart from Relationships Australia, whether there's much work going on to really look at that side of things, because it's escaping violence, and I know they're building more women's shelters here, because one of the biggest crises certainly in this state is the lack of housing and the homelessness issue. And of course, possibly your last speaker talked about that women over 50 are the biggest group as regards homelessness. Becomes a lot harder to get work, and if you're a woman on your own, unless you have good work, it's a very difficult situation. Having said that, about women and violence, of course, in a number of Aboriginal communities, and I'm thinking now not so much of Tasmania, although there is that proportion of violence, but certainly up north, that some of that is disproportionately more. And as was said in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, you know, Aboriginal people are not violent. You know, it's not something in the nature, but it's something in terms of how things have been done to, rather than people listened to. And that's, I would think, one of the reasons that we have not seen much happening to support women properly in communities. And I would say that's why I very much go for the, if I may say so, I don't know how, whether this is appropriate, but the yes vote. And I do know that there are people in Aboriginal communities saying treaty first, but all the people speaking well on this issue would say, look, we really respect that, but go back to the process at Uluru, because there you will see why it is that voice was prioritised over treaty, knowing that treaty is the longer process, but that the voice will actually bring in the step-by-step process. That's another issue. But just to, one of the reasons people haven't been listened to, and the closing the gap can surely only happen where people are listened to. So that's sort of looking a bit at that issue. And I'm not near enough it to comment much more on how much violence or how that's all happening, etc., etc. But I think that the time that we've spent generally on these national plans of action hasn't brought us at the moment to where we need to be. So I'm really hoping with the strategies hopefully in place, or beginning to be in place, we will actually start moving forward. So that's perhaps a bit on that issue.
I'd like to say something on the voice, if I may, and clearly I'm not an Indigenous Australian. We have Mary Kerr here with us.
I wondered, about that, and whether or not I'm hope, Mary, I'm not saying anything out of hand or out of place here.
Oh, it's okay.
The thing is, I was just going to say that if we think about women's situation, I think that most of us would say that it's important that our voice is heard, and therefore I suppose that we feel, well, I suppose I feel that I would certainly vote yes to the voice of Indigenous Australians. But perhaps Helen, we've got Dr. Helen Pringle, who's an associate professor at University of New South Wales, Mary Kerr, who is from the Northern Territory Police Force. We're fortunate she's down from Darwin here in Sydney. Yeah, and we should have Bashi Kumar, who has a background in relation to maternity and women's health in the maternity area, but she's not with us because she has 2 young children in preschool, kindergarten age, and of course they bring home allergy and she's suffering from that. And we have Kerry Heubel, who was the first executive officer with the Women's Advisory Council in New South Wales back at the end of the 1970s, and now is a teacher in adult education. So I'm not sure if any of us have questions arising from what Yabbo has covered so far. Yes? No. No. So go on. If you go on with another area, then yes.
So Mary, particularly to addressing you for Reconciliation Week, I'm part of Reconciliation Tasmania, and have been involved with reconciliation since the late 70s in one way or another here. We had 3 Aboriginal speakers, 2 women and 1 man, and one of the women is going to vote no, believing that treaty is the most important. The other is going to vote yes. And it was a most respectful discussion. And I felt that was such a great way. And both were saying that same sort of thing about, you know, the need to listen to, and particularly to listen to women's voices. So that was really important. And I guess thinking of the fact you were going to have Bashi here, I've also worked a lot with women who've come as refugees and migrants, particularly those who've come as refugees. And we had 5 consecutive years when I worked with Glenorchy City Council on multicultural women's gatherings. And that was also supported by the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health in Melbourne, which is a national organisation, and particularly with Regina Quiason, who is their policy officer. And from those gatherings, it's still very clear, language, of course, is the biggest issue for a lot of people who've come, and particularly women as refugees, and also those who've come as migrants, because it's often the male spouse as migrants that has the work or has the study, and therefore it's much harder for women. And also it's about how to get the information. I mean, it's a bit like going back to The Voice. People say we haven't got enough information. And there you can obviously say to people, well, you've got to be more proactive. But in the case of those who've come as refugees and migrants, it's building it's building their knowledge about where they are. It's building their capacity, I think, in the leadership side to bring that confidence there. In fact, I just was on a panel for a new leadership course, not just for women, but generally for people who've come as migrants or refugees. And that does seem to be a really good way to go in terms of building the capacity of people. And we had another one through the Centre for Multicultural Health that I was involved in back in 2012 that also was really good in building that capacity. So that's sort of certain aspect. And I think some of the issues like violence against women or other reproductive health issues, etc., are fairly taboo still for many to talk about. So that's been a fairly tricky as well.
I was actually looking at this paper, Yabbo, that you gave to it's the one on the Human Rights Act, Women, Human Rights and a Human Rights Act for Australia. If we look at CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, do you think that that has done a job that's a positive one in terms of advancing women's rights? Or do you think that, where do you think we stand in terms of having signed it back in 1980, ratified it in 1983? I think we signed the optional protocol in 2009, and has it been a useful international instrument insofar as women's rights are an issue?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I hold with others an International Women's Day event, small event each year, but we do it in support of Amnesty International and the International Women's Development Agency. And we look at what's happened for women and what's to happen, and we have speakers that might be their own personal story. Look, I think it's been and it does show that we've come a long way. So I do think, that's been a really important thing. One of the difficulties now is the fact of those COVID years, as I mentioned right at the beginning, and the fact that that sent things a little bit further back for women. And also, I think in Australia, that 10 years of a very conservative government that didn't care about women. So in terms of us, I think it's been fairly challenging. And I mean, we could look at the pay gap in that. The pay gap was slightly better just before COVID than it is now. But there is, I feel like there's more attempt by this government on issues pertaining to women, and they've got a bit more awareness of CEDAW and those sort of instruments that I think will be very helpful. So I'm feeling more hopeful.
Good. Just one little question. You talk about a Human Rights Act as opposed to perhaps a Bill of Human Rights.
Oh yes, yeah. I know. Yeah.
Communication, Constitution. Could you tell us more specifically what it is you're looking for here? is it a separate act that you government departments have to be aware of, or is it going to be situated within the Constitution and would have to go as a referendum?
I don't know. I think I mean I haven't really sort of researched that, but I think what through Amnesty International is the fact that we are amongst a few countries who don't have a Human Rights Act. Whether or not that should go through another referendum, but I think there needs to be at least a Bill of Rights for Australia. So I mean, I think that's a down the track referendum, but I think a bill is definitely needed. And we are also talking about one for Tasmania. That's through Equal Opportunity, that used to be called the Office of the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner that Jocelynne was running.
What's it called now?
Equal Opportunity.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
right.
And so they're working towards, they've got a campaign for Human Rights Act for Tasmania. Yeah, but I think the referendum questions, that you are right, it is more of the bill. Yeah, Bill of Rights.
It's interesting because in the United Kingdom, the Conservative, the Human Rights Act came in 1998 under the Blair Labor government, and the Conservative government under Rishi Sunak and the number of leaders it's had over, I think, about 4 years, they're talking about abolishing it. What they're saying is they want one that's specific to the United Kingdom, because of course the Bill of Rights there is based on the European Bill of Rights provisions. But one wonders how different it would be if it still affirms human rights. But that's just as an aside in terms of what's going on there. So there's this push and pull, isn't there, in terms of going backwards and in terms of going forwards, which is the hopeful approach now. Just when you were talking to, and it reminds me of what I thought about when Deborah Towns was speaking too, that one of the things about raising issues is that Oscar Wilde once said, there's no such thing as an indiscreet question, only indiscreet answers. And I was thinking about that when Deborah talked about being in the room and saying you're sitting next to or in front of or behind or beside a sexual harasser. And then the people who came to her and said it was wrong of her to say that and were upset. And that was because, not because of her question, which is, I'm framing it as her comment, that there would be a sexual harasser behind or next to, etc. But it was because of the answer that upset them, because the answer was that, yes, I am sitting next to, or I am a sexual harasser who's sitting behind or besides, etc. And I think that when we talk about listening too, the problem is that it's not that people are not speaking, it's that they're not being heard, and that the listening factor is not being exercised. Because we know that women have been speaking for centuries, and since we invaded this country, Indigenous Australians have been speaking. So the voice has been there, but the voice has not been paid attention to. But yeah, are there any other issues that we members would like to ask of Yabbo Thompson?
Probably about the pay gap. I don't know if we've spoken about that. We've talked about pay gap here with women.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to have equality here, until we've dealt with some, these issues like violence, and the pay gap is one. I mean, it's still, if we talk about around 2.4 billion women of working age not being afforded the equal economic opportunity, and 178 countries maintain legal barriers that really prevent women's full economic participation. So that was obviously something I took from a World Bank report. So currently here, we're saying it's the gap is 14.1%, and it was slightly less than that, as I said, just pre-COVID. But there's significant barriers for women, and we know that more women lost their employment with COVID than men. And then the other barriers are about, you know, the childcare and the affordability of that. The other barriers are still the representation of women in senior positions. Sometimes if they get to that senior position, the actual title is downgraded in a way. So instead of being, you know, I don't know, executive officer, it might be something other officer. But I know that's got better, and we are seeing more women. I mean, again, you want it to be in a different way than it's been. I suffered, just as a personal story, suffered from what I call psychos, and it is a phenomena as CEOs of organisations, and this was non-government organisations. I worked with Relationships Australia, Carers Tasmania, and Migrant Resource Centre in the latter part of my employment years. And I'd go along for a while, and then there'd be a new CEO who was this psycho, who that part of that phenomena is feeling threatened and wanting to and not having the confidence, and therefore surrounding themselves with yes people. And we still see this hierarchical aspect, whether it's men or women in those roles. And I had both that I suffered from, in a sense, and some of it was quite bad, the kind of bullying that I experienced. And I know that older women do. I don't know whether it's disproportionately that. I don't think so, because young women, I've spoken to numbers. I've got younger friends, and you know, it is still there in our workplaces. We do have more flat structures. And sometimes those are in, you know, more the sort of corporate or IT sectors than they might be in government or NGOs. But, you know, again, I couldn't, you know, necessarily testify to that. But I think that's another barrier for women, because I know that in one employment, it was because I was older and sort of knew what I was doing. I shouldn't say sort of, I knew what I was doing, that was a threat. So I know that women do suffer from that quite a bit. The other aspect for women is the need for flexibility because of childcare or caring for a parent or other family member. And then there might be the whole differences in education, work experiences, and so on. And the fact that so many women are in the occupations that are still so feminized, you know, that are lower paid, you know, the child care and aged care, which should have the most skilled people in it. And we know from that recent incident of an elderly woman in a home who was tasered that, you know, my feeling, I mean, I know nothing of the case, but I'm sort of wondering why that hadn't been de-escalated as an instant earlier. But how might I know? I don't know what there might have been, you know, a whole lot that was too difficult. But I know that too few people understand in that sort of workplace how you deal with things like the different forms of dementia, because you've got not just Alzheimer's, you've got other dementias, including vascular dementia, which is another violent type of dementia, or can be. I've got a sister-in-law with it, for instance. So those sort of, and then there's the hiring things and how to make sure there's affirmative action, and that's with certain organisations, but it's still not with enough, and we've still not got enough women getting into, I think the last speaker spoke about that, in engineering and some of those, and the science areas, including, you know, stem cell research and all of those sorts of things. Yeah. And of course, migrant women, it's harder, and those on temporary visas, you know, yeah, women with disabilities, we're still not, you know, understanding that properly.
What about, could I just ask about older women, because you've mentioned older women in passing, I think, and the issue about being competent and having knowledge and experience and therefore being seen as a threat. That's one issue with older women. You've also raised the issue about the housing, and that impacts on older women, because it would be helpful to, and then the pensions gap, which arises out of the wage gap. So have you had experience in this area of older women's rights? That would be helpful, I think, if you've got any, you clearly have a very broad experience.
Not in detail, it's hard, but I guess, you know, in talking to people, because I'm an older woman, but not that old, but yeah, look, women stay in employment sometimes longer than they want to, not always. Others, like myself, who might have wanted to stay longer, had to leave because of receiving this kind of bullying approach. And I think that it's, I mean, it's like for any person, when you're not treated well, it leads to all sorts of difficult health outcomes. And that's certainly I've seen with certain women that I know, that it's, and especially if they haven't sought particular help and support around those issues, it's really, really difficult. And I know that there's also a lot of anxiety around because of the poverty issue, which I'd mentioned earlier. You know, women over 50 are the biggest group of homeless. And I think that's a really tricky issue, and it's not easily addressed because we've got not only lack of housing, but lack of affordable housing, which is really, really difficult. And I know for certain people. And I just remember the other day, Jackie Lambie, Senator Lambie, was at a rally in Hobart, which was against a stadium that's being proposed here. And she said, I've got two, I won't say it in her accent, I've got two women in my house at the moment, two of my friends, because they haven't got a roof over their heads. And I think that, you know, and I hear that time and time again, because you don't see numbers of women on the streets who are homeless because they're living in their cars, they're couch surfing, they're staying with friends, they're moving from shed to shed, you know, this kind of thing. I think it's a really big problem.
I think that it's one that tends to be invisible too, that women's homelessness tends to be invisible. Men's homelessness is so often apparent because it's actually on the street, but women find other ways to scrabble about, and because it's more frightening for a woman to be on the street. But Helen Pringle, did you have any issue?
That was pretty much covered everything, I think. So, and I think that the question of women's homelessness is very important.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Just one last thing. I think every woman, as they get older, experiences the invisibleness of being an older woman, which younger people, male or female, generally not only don't experience, they don't see it. And they don't see it because older women are invisible. And it doesn't matter if you're a professional woman, an affluent woman, or the rest of us. We're just not important in this society.
Though it's interesting because Marie Andrews, who is an Indigenous First Nations barrister, written in one of my books about how she, on the street, tended to be invisible. So I think I agree absolutely with Kerry Heubel that older women tend to be invisible, and if you're in the queue at the shop, you'll be overlooked, and somebody else will be there, as if you actually are not there. It's a most extraordinary phenomenon.
I think it's a very difficult one.
Isn't there a book called Invisible Women just published
Possibly
last year in England, I think.
In England, right?
About older women.
Oh no, there's
Invisible was a different story, isn't it?
What's that?
That was a.
There's one.
Hags.
Oh, hags. Yes. Well, look, Yabbo, it's been really wonderful to have you. Thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate it very much. We are intending to put this all together for a submission to the CEDAW Committee, which will be doing its review of Australia next year. As I'm sure you know, it's begun the review process. They've got some new process now, and we're coming up for review next year. And we just thought it'd be wonderful to take this opportunity to get together. We've had a wonderful lineup of women, and we've got more this afternoon. So very much appreciated. Is there any final point that you'd like to make before we wrap up?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I did want to talk about the. Oh, sorry. I'll get there. Yeah, that there's a lot of action that we can take as women, and working with allies that we can make of men. You know, I feel too much at the moment, and whether it's social media, that there's not a lot of proactivity. The fact that, you know, I'll go into a school like I did on Tuesday, 100 staff, to talk about the voice and the referendum and ask how much they knew. And there was so much of the conversation, oh, I haven't heard much about it, which is like our leader of the opposition, he didn't know much about it. We're not being proactive as a society to find out what's going on. So I guess that's a call for arms for people.
Good. Thanks so much, Yabbo. Good to have you. And we'll adjourn now until we'll come back after lunch. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.